Hello everyone, today we start the second chapter of the first book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. Its title being End and Means in War. So in the last videos we proceeded by talking paragraph by paragraph. Now the paragraphs here are very long, so we have to divide this into sections, and the title of the video will simply be like chapter 2, part 1, 2, 3, etc. The text follows for today's ratio. Having in the foregoing chapter ascertained the complicated and variable nature of war, we shall now occupy ourselves in examining into the influence which this nature has upon the end and means in war. If we ask, first of all, for the object upon which the whole effort of war is to be directed, in order that it may suffice for the attainment of the political object, we shall find that it is just as variable as are the political object and the particular circumstances of the war. If, in the next place, we keep once more to the pure conception of war, then we must say that the political object properly lies out of its province, for if war is an act of violence to compel the enemy to fulfill our will, then in every case all depends on our overthrowing the enemy, that is, disarming him, and on that alone. This object, developed from abstract conceptions, but which is also the one aimed at in a great many cases in reality, we shall, in the first place, examine in this reality. In connection with the plan of a campaign, we shall hereafter examine more closely into the meaning of disarming a nation. But here we must at once draw a distinction between three things, which, as three general objects, comprise everything else within them. They are the military power, the country, and the will of the enemy. The military power must be destroyed, that is, reduced to such a state as not to be able to prosecute the war. This is the sense in which we wish to be understood hereafter whenever we use the expression destruction of the enemy's military power. The country must be conquered, for out of the country a new military force may be formed. But even when both these things are done, still the war, that is, the hostile feeling and action of hostile agencies, cannot be considered as at an end as long as the will of the enemy is not subdued also. That is, its government and its allies must be forced into signing a peace, or the people into submission. For whilst we are in full occupation of the country, the war may break out afresh, either in the interior or through assistance given by allies. No doubt, this may also take place after a peace, but that shows nothing more than every war does not carry in itself the elements for a complete decision and final settlement. But even if this is the case, still with the conclusion of peace a number of sparks are always extinguished which would have smouldered on quietly, and the excitement of the passion abates, because all those whose minds are disposed to peace, of which in all nations and under all circumstances there is always a great number, turn themselves away completely from the road to resistance. Whatever may take place subsequently, we must always look upon the object as attained, and the business of war as ended by a peace. As protection of the country is the primary object for which the military force exists, therefore the natural order is that first of all this force should be destroyed, then the country subdued. And through the effect of these two results, as well as the position we then hold, the enemy should be forced to make peace. Generally, the destruction of the enemy's force is done by degrees, and in just the same measure the conquest of the country follows immediately. The two likewise usually react upon each other, because the loss of provinces occasions a diminution of military force. But this order is by no means necessary, and on that account it also does not always take place. The enemy's army, before it is sensibly weakened, may retreat to the opposite side of the country, or even quite outside of it. In that case, therefore, the greater part of the whole of the country is conquered. But this object of war in the abstract, this final means of attaining the political object in which all others are combined, the disarming of the enemy, is rarely attained in practice, and is not a condition necessary to peace. Therefore, it can in no wise be set up in theory as a law. There are innumerable instances of treatises in which peace can be settled before either party could be looked upon as disarmed. Indeed, even before the balance of power had undergone any sensible alteration. Nay, further, if we look at the case in the concrete, then we must say that in a whole class of cases, the idea of a complete defeat of the enemy would be a mere imaginative flight, especially when the enemy is considerably superior. So, here we get in a more discursive part of the topic, and von Clausewitz in this paragraph addresses, as the first phrase basically states, that we have to look at the influence that the very complicated and variable nature of war has upon the ends and means in war itself. So, von Clausewitz has given us the piece of theory, right, that fundamentally shows how war works in its ensemble. Now we have to see how this character influences real war and how it effectively works. So the first point that is addressed is that of where the war effort has to be directed, so that it can suffice for the attainment of the political object. Von Clausewitz brilliantly points out once again that this effort is basically this direction is so variable as much as the political object and also the particular circumstances of the war. So these two elements fundamentally are the factors that control and modify respectively war from its abstract conception and make it, a real one. So here von Clausewitz readdresses, in fact, the pure conception of war, the purely abstract one, and in recalling also that relatively to this, the political object properly lies out of war in itself. For war is an act of violence to compel the enemy to fulfill our will. So, if we were to stick simply to this, in every case, everything would depend on our overthrowing. If we take the side of the fighter, on overthrowing the enemy. That is, as we have seen, if you recall, disarming him, effectively not annihilating him in a merely physical sense, but simply disarming him. We don't have to really kill ideally this abstract enemy. We would just want to make him do whatever we want, right? Then of course in real war killing is involved as kind of a standard practice, but this is just in a way it takes war takes shape into reality, right? But the general goal is not to really wipe out everyone, unless you don't have a specific reason that is dictated by the political object and the particular circumstances of the war. But otherwise, that's that's even beyond that. That's still, by the way, dictated probably by some other, in fact, these other conditions, and it shouldn't be what in abstract you would have to do in order to win the war in general. It suffices for the enemy to surrender and to do whatever you want, which is naturally, as you understand, and especially if you take an enemy like a state, a nation, a country, etc., you realize that it's something particularly complicated, but von Clausewitz here is just reassessing it, as we will see now. Interestingly enough, what von Clausewitz says in here is that the aim of disarming the enemy, although as an object, and although developed, derived from these abstract conceptions in the theory of war, is, however, also the actual object that, in great many cases, you have one aims at in reality proper, right? So this is particularly interesting because this is at least the aim through which war is for which war is used, actually, both in the abstraction and in the reality. You want to disarm the enemy. Once again, you don't need to do to aim fundamentally for else if you want to win a war. Then here there would be an interesting digression to make relatively to what is that you can do after a war. But von Clausewitz takes that into consideration as well, meaning, but it's still at that point detached from the aim of real wars as well. In terms, like, if you want to annihilate, for example, that population, it's not a strictly military aim. In this sense, war is in the way you deliver violence in order to compel the enemy to fulfill your will. Then eventually you can even wipe him out. You can even make genocide in this sense. But it's still another thing. This here, von Clausewitz is talking about something very different. The rest is just purely relative to whatever you have in mind. Because let's remember this, everybody has his own reason for making a war. We don't have to think, this is the beauty of the Clausewitzian thoughts, that it doesn't deal at all with what the motives of your war could be. Here, the motives can be as many as infinite, basically, as many as every person at least may have, and they change constantly. So von Clausewitz is not advocating for any reason of war. He's not trying to justify war. He's trying to motivate partially the way at least war is waged. Then in part you will see also why, what for. I mean, there can be additional results you want to achieve during the fight, but that's still something that pertains strictly to these unknown wishes you have. But let's close this digression because it's at this moment it's not really what we're looking for. So then he goes on and says that in connection with the plan of a campaign, we shall hereafter examine more closely into the meaning of disarming a nation. But here, at least, we must at once draw a distinction between three things which, as three general objects, comprise everything else within them. They are the military power, the country, and the will of the enemy. So basically, in order to obtain the disarmament of the enemy, you have to bear in mind these three elements that comprise in war basically any other aspect in itself. So the military power, let's repeat it, the military power, the country, and the will of the enemy. So here von Clausewitz explains in which way. Starting from the military power must be destroyed. That is, reduced to such a state as not to be able to prosecute the war. So this is particularly important, because in order to destroy a military power, you don't have necessarily to wipe it out from the face of the earth. You have just put it in the condition that is not able to protract the hostilities. And this, most of the times, it actually it's really how most of military systems really come apart, really. But we'll see now that this triad all compenetrates each other, right? So the state here of the military power can also entail strictly a mechanical aspect of it, not really the pneuma, let's say the spirit, the will of the enemy, now that we'll partly analyze into this. Clausewitz goes on and says, this is the sense in which we wish to be understood hereafter whenever we use the expression destruction of the enemy's military power. So here is to bear in mind while you read the work what destruction of the enemy's military power means. That is, to reduce it in such a state as not to be able to prosecute the war. This is not physically annihilating it, or not even killing him. If you take into consideration the fighting force in the human in its human element, right? And it can happen through various other means that are not strictly military, by the way. Then it passes to the country. The country must be conquered, for out of the country a new military force may be formed. So this is very clear, very logical. If you don't conquer the country, if you don't control it afterwards, this country can produce other military force, can put up new armies and continue existing, etc. So by seizing the country, by conquering it by arms, you can control the resources through which a new military force may be formed if you were not there to check to control the local population fundamentally. So the principles are very clear. The military power must be destroyed. The country must be conquered. And these are very intuitive, right? You know, the first one is, it required that specific, let's say, small explanation that a country must be conquered is, as easy as, saying it, what you have to do it for. Von Clausewitz says, but even when both these things are done, and beware, because this is particularly interesting, still the war, that is, the hostile feeling and action of hostile agencies, cannot be considered as at an end as long as the will of the enemy is not subdued also. This is of dramatic importance in all history, in all military history. You can even destroy military power, you can conquer a country and occupy it and preside in it, but still you're not done with that. You also have to bring the enemy to stop, to be willing to fight, right? The enemy has to lose the will to take the fight on, and this derives from the hostile feeling and the action of hostile agencies, right? And this distinction is particularly important because you can have an hostile population that doesn't like you to be in their country, but also there are other agents, as he calls them here, that is, as von Clausewitz going on says, its government and its allies, right? So this is particularly meaningful. Think about, I don't know, think about the French government in exile of Charles de Gaulle in Britain during World War II. In there, you don't even have actually a government on the soil of the country. It's actually somewhere else. But it's even a government in itself. And in that case as well, it's allies, right? So other people that are fighting actually from outside the country, in this case, it can intervene into the country, as even the example of World War II is very clear in that sense, that are possibly able to revive the will of the enemy to keep on fighting on his own soil and even in the population. So who is left there under your alleged control, right? So as a consequence, what you must be forced what you must do is to force both the government and the allies into signing a peace, right? So here we're still talking in very theoretical terms, right? It's not that you necessarily have, historically speaking, these combinations have been and variables have been quite quite infinite in the degree that this happened and didn't happen. With today that even not just signs a peace proper, but with also that actually starts a war, diplomatically speaking. Everything is here to be meant very fluidly, very very concretely. At one time, and also understanding in these terms are kind of conventional, right? So von Clausewitz is very careful and accurate in telling this, and it says either signing a peace, or force the people into submission. This is important because whilst you are engaged in the full occupation of the country, whether it has already taken place actually, or it has still to be accomplished, the war may break out afresh from one that it seemed, either in the interior or through the assistance given by the Allies. And von Clausewitz makes also this very poignant point, says, no doubt this may also take place after a peace, right? So it's not that, if you sign a peace or force someone into submission that is somewhat formalized, this brings an end to hostility forever. It's not. But this still reconfirms the Clausewitzian theory, because von Clausewitz says that shows nothing more than that every war does not carry in itself the elements for a complete decision and final settlement. In other words, war is never absolute. We have explained that a big deal in the previous chapter, and this is the kind of fluid dimension that you have always to keep in mind when you study von Clausewitz, because from one side there is theory, from the other one there is reality, and the two things compenetrate each other. Always. So you should always force, for the practical reasons that we will see now, the enemy into some form of settlement, of agreement, either peace treaty or an act of submission of some sort, but that let's say the political situations can change in the most diverse ways, and the war may break out afresh once again, even after this, right? And this has to do with the solid, let's say, and not absolute character of war. But, and von Clausewitz goes on, but even if this is the case, still with the conclusion of peace, a number of sparks are always extinguished, which would have smoldered on quietly, and the excitement of the passions abates, because all those whose minds are disposed to peace, of which in all nations and under all circumstances there is always a great number, turn themselves away completely from the road to resistance. Now, this is a brilliant piece, because it basically gives you a very pragmatic evidence rather than just an advice, because it says, no doubt you can theoretically, even without a peace treaty, why is this peace treaty or the act of submission important? Because this settlements make the sparks of resistance dying much faster, because in every country, you can't even say in history, meaning in the past, but in every kind of reality of in the human society, there is always a consistent group of people who advocates for peace, right? In a way or in another, you don't have necessarily to be a pacifist. You can believe, maybe you may have believed in the war in itself, but you realize now it's lost, that it's useless to go on, or maybe you have some interest, or maybe you sided against that particular war because maybe you want to be invaded, because you want to collaborate with the invaders, or you maybe you're an oppressed minority that doesn't want to go on. So there is always a part of the country that that pushes for peace as much as there is the one that pushes for war, and for resistance, actually, as you understand it, even after the signing of a peace treaty or an act of submission, there is always someone who fights on in some way or another. It can even be a passive resistance or something like that. So such formal declaration of ceasefire proper is particularly important because it kind of reinvigorates the side that pushes for peace, and therefore it kind of influences the whole system to cease fire completely, or at least to radically put it down in some way. So and naturally shakes also the conscience of those who are kind of undecided, right? Always remember that also in here, I remember when von Clausewitz said about what's said about human nature, that tends always to stay away from an excessive exertion. And yeah, well, even in this probably there is a part of it, because it basically means that human nature, even if it may have this hostile feeling and intentions, when it says that everything is dying out, basically say, okay, well, I'm out of here as well, because my interest to go on maybe is still there, but now it becomes increasingly difficult. So even just by giving force to the peace party, let's say, all the war party automatically weakens, right? So, and it's much easier to bring someone to cease the hostility than to continue it. This is the point I wanted to get. I mean, it requires way more effort to keep on fighting than to stop fighting. So tendentially, human nature pushes for stopping to fight, rather than the contrary, rather than what it's sometimes very ideologically portrayed, as if humans were kind of warmongers that just want bloodshed and fighting each other again forever for no specified reason. But it is really not the case, anthropologically speaking, historically speaking. So this should be pretty clear, and it's not a matter of opinion, really. Von Clausewitz goes on and says, whatever may take place subsequently, we must always look upon the object as attained and the business of war as ended by a peace, right? So this is kind of an approximation, if you want. It's not a peace treaty doesn't grant you that things will kind of finish so easily or so quickly, but still it's pretty it kind of facilitates things pretty much. That's also why during negotiations, etc., there is kind of a ceasefire, because everything kind of becomes easier most of the times, and it's relatively easy to attain than just going on fighting. Remember the suspension of the military action that actually makes up a great part of the conflict proper, of the same time of war, right? So it's very easy to get that, while it's more difficult to push someone to fight once again. Clausewitz goes on and says, as protection of the country is the primary object for which the military force exists, therefore the natural order is that first of all this force should be destroyed, then the country subdued. So this is elementary and self-explanatory. The military force exists primarily as protection of the country. So that's its first object. That's the easiest one to attain. We have seen what we just said, that fundamentally it's way more likely to stay where you are than to embark yourself into attacking someone in absolute terms, because we are kind of lazy and we tend to delay the action, even if we actually have some pressing reasons, or maybe we tend to hesitate even. But from one side, we have also seen in this defensive perspective of the protection of the countries that defense is a stronger form of war than attack. Even if it has a negative object, while the attack has a positive one, still defense is stronger. So it kind of gives you, at least individually as the defender, some lesser consumption of your own resources compared to the ones of the enemy. On average, of course, depending on the situation, but on average, that's or in absolute, if you want, that's what happens. Therefore, the natural order in war is that, first of all, this force, if you want to invade someone's country, you have to destroy its military force. Then you have to subdue the country. So it's crystalline clear. First you destroy the military force, then you subdue the country. There is, I think, nothing to explain. It's like, someone basically is incapacitated into a fight, and then you can take custody of him. That's properly it. This doesn't still assure that the person wouldn't like to keep on fighting, but even the having put him out of action in strictly and its offensive capabilities is heavily interfering and influencing on his ability of striking back, even if he may have all the revenge, the resentment that we know. And this is also historically pretty clear. There are countries that are effectively annihilated from a military point of view, that they resent so much and so hard, and because that the memory of that defeat burns, and there is all maybe very important cultural, political consequences of this, together always summed with other factors, given that war is not an isolated act in itself, but it comes from several other causes. Then the conflictuality between those two singular elements. Think about, I don't know, well, there are many examples in history. I don't want to talk always about World War II, but still, that's a bit like, the wars from the second half of the night. If you take the 19th or 20th century, the resentment between the French and the Germans in general, and there is always the revanchism and all this stuff, because there are, these things matter, these things have an impact. But you can talk about United States during the Civil War. It's always the case. War is a brutal affair. It's pretty unfair. It kills people. People die and suffer. You can't study history if you don't understand what it means to kill, to get killed, to get your family killed, and this is something you can't really eliminate. And it's particularly important because eventually the political action will be heavily influenced by this. You can't ask to a person who has lost his family in a war whether that war was worth it. It's obvious that from that subjective perspective, it's always going to be, even if there was a kind of a good reason for that war, that person and his family has been destroyed. So that, as relative, as subjective it can be, still makes for it still influences how that person will participate to policy and other stuff. It will have an impact even in its country direction after that, and this is never to be forgotten. Here, Von Clausewitz was writing. It's always important to recall, was writing after a war that had seen his country annihilated, and then kind of ransomed in this sense by the war of liberation against Napoleon, etc., but still having suffered a big deal of destruction, of submission, of losses, etc. Von Clausewitz had gone to fight abroad for his own country, even being excuse me, because I'm trying to kill a fly here that brought him even as to fight as an exile. That's particularly important because you see in there that even a part of the country that was Prussia had lots of exiles that went fighting into Russia against Napoleon, and then eventually the Tsars helped to restore the Prussian sovereignty against the French, etc. So this was an author that lived on his skin all what he's talking about for real. The Vom Kriege is born out of this experience, first-hand experience from a person who lived all of this first-hand on the battlefield proper, right? So and never tell a soldier in this sense that he doesn't know the cost of war, what it is. So that is the naturally von Clausewitz was just more than a soldier. He was evidently a great he was a genius, a greatly educated and intellectually developed person, and therefore we have the privilege in this sense to observe the product of not just of an intellectual of a scholar, but actually of someone who had perfectly understood the cost of certain things and therefore could explain them and mold by the way, a very objective, still very objective and accurate and clear picture of reality through describing a war and its relation with policy, with society, etc. Then von Clausewitz says, and through the effect of these two results, so these two results I just said is, let's repeat it briefly, the destruction of the military the military force of the enemy and the subjugation of his own country. So in other words, it's what we were saying before of the triad that we came up with today: military power in country, right, taken out of place. Now, the will of the enemy now remains. So he says, and through the effect of these two results, as well as the position we then hold, so the one of conquerors, the enemy should be forced to make peace. Should be forced, right? It's full of examples in military history where you annihilate the military force of a country, you occupy the country, but still you can't control the country. That's very it's very out there pretty much for anyone to see. So you should force the enemy, this enemy who is the enemy. That's the real point. Von Clausewitz now is not telling you, the enemy is that guy over there. You have to spot, in fact, what the enemy is. Who is that has this will to keep on fighting, and why, for which reasons. But for you, it's still better to force this general pacification with all the means that obviously you have at your disposal. You shouldn't, waste much resources. If you have this possibility at hand, unless obviously this doesn't bring to other losses, but that's what you should be doing. Von Clausewitz says, then generally the destruction of the enemy's force is done by degrees, and in just the same measure the conquest of the country follows immediately. So here von Clausewitz establishes a direct proportionality between the destruction, the progressive, the gradual destruction of the enemy's force, and the conquest, the occupation of the country. So in other words, as long as the enemy force gets shrinking, and the more you conquer, that is kind of intuitive, right? Then he says, the two likewise usually react upon each other because the loss of provinces occasions a diminution of military force. So here he explains that yes, these things usually interact upon each other. Actually, they always interact upon each other, but it's not really a direct proportion. This is my mistake, actually. I said before to make it a better phrase and more concise, but it's not always necessary, because first of all, in the process of conquest, you may let's say logorate the enemy forces, but still you could also logorate your own, so you still need a certain amount of resources to materially occupy the country. So it doesn't just take, at least not always, to simply annihilate the enemy to have a kind of a control. It happens in history many times, actually, that when an enemy army is annihilated, it's relatively easy to control a large territory. This is especially evident, especially on a kind of a spatial scale, on a larger spatial scale, with the achievements of modern civilization, with the increase in power and destruction of our technology, so that you can't control large amounts of territories just having a very few troops armed in a certain way than what it was like in the Middle Ages or in the ancient world, where it was way more difficult to effectively control a territory, but to reach an hegemony, right? So in modern times, it's way easier to control a territory, usually, on average at least, than it was to control the past. I might not say it is even now I have the doubt that this might not be really true, but it's really the let's say the range of the effect of military potential that is larger, right? So this doesn't necessarily mean that you can control easier everything, because the enemy can be armed naturally in the same way you are. But if you were to take the average disarmed population in today and an unarmed force with today's weapons, well, with this force you can control a much larger amount of people, actually, not just a certain amount of territory, also on average, depending on if you're given an even demographic density, or saying kind of environmental conditions, than what it was possible to do in the past. That's why if we were in order to destroy a Roman legion today, you would just take one guy with a machine gun, basically. So that's pretty evident. So these two things, like the destruction of the armed force and the conquest of a country, usually proceed hand in hand, right? But Von Clausewitz says, but this order is by no means necessary, and on that account it also does not always take place. So as well, it may not happen, at least all the time. Excuse me, I drink a little before we go on. Von Clausewitz says, the enemy's army, before it is sensibly weakened, may retreat to the opposite side of the country, or even quite outside of it. In this case, therefore, the greater part or the whole of the country is conquered. Right, so this is clear. The enemy may have all the interest to deploy his troops in a fashion that leaves even great parts of his country disarmed and occupied. And think about the scorched earth strategy that's been very frequently practiced, still always kind of practiced to some degree. Here Von Clausewitz says that the enemy army can actually even go outside of his own territory, and this happens too. Maybe not so frequently nor excessively intuitively, but there are examples in military history where an army, two armies went fighting. Actually, in a war of invasion, you find the defending army shifting his position to outside his own borders. Right? It all depends on the circumstances. In this case, von Clausewitz says, therefore, the greater part. So I had already read it, and I hadn't explained it though. So however, it's self-explanatory. At this point, that country is without protection. So here also the armed force has to be understood for what it is for real. I mean, it's not that you still can't have even phenomena like a resistance of a kind of an autonomous military organization, but realistically speaking, in I think all the historical times, basically once you wiped out an army, you have wiped out at least great part of the resources of an entire country. This is particularly important to study military history in general. Obviously, with industrialization, etc., there have been means to recover more quickly resources and to field many more arms that could be done in the past, but it still doesn't change, because proportionally speaking, the resources that are mobilized in order to wage war are so imposant that while when an army is destroyed, well, most of the time this equates to the impossibility of that country of resisting, at least. And this is normally, I mean, concentration of forces is also one of the principles of classical principles of war. So it's normal to fight with kind of large chunks of your armed forces that are kind of usually at least fighting either together, or they are holding an enemy in different sectors that, however, when a part is lost, the whole thing tends to crumble, and generally speaking, this ensemble that simply melts away. It's very important to see this, how an army tears itself apart, comes itself apart when there is no other way you fight, and this has a lot to do also with the will of the enemy to fight. So that's, even the moral forces are practically also one of the objectives of the of war. The annihilation of them, at least, is one object of war. But still, this usually occurs when you considerably weaken the military force at one point that even with all that will to go on fighting, you don't have an armed force to fight on anymore. So that's the examples we were saying before. You can even destroy a military force and occupy a country in sequence, but you still may have an hostile population, right? And that feeling may not be extinguished so easily, and it often doesn't, right? Then von Clausewitz says, but this object of war, in the abstract, this final means of the attaining the political object in which all others are combined, the disarming of the enemy, is rarely attained in practice and is not a condition necessary to peace. So this is particularly important. So in other words, wars that are fought today basically never get to the real disarming of the enemy. It's rarely attained in practice. I mean, it happens, but it's always, first of all, if we were to make it a strictly mathematical calculation, well, it really does never happen, because there is always by approximation someone who who doesn't give up, or at least a a sort of reshaping of a local government, even of autonomous armed forces, for many reasons that at that point also naturally have to do with politics, because that's what controls war, and war is just an instrument of politics, nothing else. And also, more importantly, disarming the enemy is not a condition necessary to peace. So in other words, you can attain peace and the whatever you have bargained in order to be fighting that war and entering into this violent dialectic with that country and his government. That I don't remember what I was going with the phrase, but you don't need disarming the enemy at that point. So Von Clausewitz says, therefore, it can in no wise be set up in theory as a law. You can't say that real wars, historical wars, bring to disarming of the enemy. It's something extremely rare, right? In fact, as von Clausewitz says, there are innumerable instances of treaties in which peace has been settled before either party could be looked upon as disarmed. Indeed, even before the balance of power had undergone any sensible alteration. So this is particularly important. It's telling you that most wars that are fought don't even get close to disarming the enemy. No, but not even to that, but not even to change sensibly the actual balance of power of those two countries, those two governments. You can't think of naturally major wars that were fought like in World War the First, World War the Second, but these are kind of exceptions, right? And they also come from greater motives that brought to those wars to be fought till the end. That, by the way, at that point were not even just about who had caused the war, but the fear that someone would take over the ashes of the losing side, of the axis. So that there were so many reasons, and once again, this was not properly even the object in itself. In fact, I don't know, both West Germany and East Germany were rearmed, obviously with all the due control, etc., by the respective allied forces came to conquer, to rule over those places, to occupy those places. So that's a very good example of how, at the end of the day, it's practically impossible to find a situation in which you go to really wipe out literally everyone, because still that's not the objective of the war. I mean, war is not absolute. War doesn't need to get to that in order to achieve what you want, and only when there are very even when war has a very political aim, you can see however such forms of annihilation, but at that point it's more like of a political war than an actual military enterprise, or at least it's driven chiefly by political reasons, not the kind of a logical of a cold calculation rather than an actual fight proper. And you can say that the more this fight is hot, and the more reaching the disarmament of the enemy is difficult, and it kind of rarely happens. But it can happen, definitely. It's not that there are powers that are not effectively annihilated. It's simply that this annihilation doesn't come out of the simply hostile feeling. It comes from something else that at that point has not to do with the military side proper, but with the political one. then von Clausewitz says, nay, further, if we look at the case in the concrete, then we must say that in a whole class of cases, the idea of a complete defeat of the enemy would be a mere imaginative flight, when the enemy is considerably superior, right? So this is the point. When the enemy is considerably superior, you basically don't even think about annihilating it. That's why also so many fights are put up, because not to annihilate someone, it's simply to resist. That's important. So to make the enemy pay so much than to make him desist, to go on further, right? And therefore this could open to a great digression, but I will skip this. But let's say, just think about certain wars in which you find, an enemy that seems apparently and greatly more more threatening, because it's so bigger than the other one. You still think, well, then it's so easy for that state to win. Well, as a matter of fact, it's really not, and that's why usually it's David that wins rather than Goliath, because Goliath also has a freaking deal of problems in order to manage itself, or may not even consider now that clash is such an important thing to lose so much, because maybe in fact David is fighting for his own survival. He's fighting for either victory or annihilation. And this opens so many interesting thoughts also on the concept of symmetry. War is never symmetrical by definition. When you hear people, this is a kind of asymmetric warfare, or symmetric war is always asymmetric. There's nothing like a definable symmetric warfare, and consequently an asymmetric one, because there is a symmetric that you can't think of. It's just like a journalistic approximation to basically tell that there are certain states that kind of fight on equal grounds or equal means, or similar doctrine, etc. But it effectively doesn't mean anything, because the forces that intervene at this point are not really about the strictly military effect, but what the motivation is. So it's firstly a political thing, and this has to be understood more clearly, and we will actually deal with it next time, because now we stop here, and in continuation we will observe it more in detail, because that's what the whole thing is about, and therefore the reconfirmation of the Clausewitzian fundamental that war is nothing but an instrument, an instrument of policy, and therefore just a prosecution of policy by other means, right? So that's pretty much it. And okay, so I'm glad we arrived finally to the second chapter. I don't have enormously more to say for now. I think obviously there's always a good reason to spend a word or two more on Clausewitzian thought, but for now I think we stop here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested to my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.